Hello, and welcome to the third module in our Psychotherapy Foundation and Formulation Introduction. In the previous module, we were thinking about emotions and understanding the purpose of them. And we touched on how we have certain basic primary emotions that are inbuilt, instinctive reaction patterns to various stimuli. And today we're going to focus on something called attachment, which is another instinctive action pattern that is inbuilt within us as mammals. Attachment refers to the kind of bonds that we form with each other, and as we'll go on to describe, how secure or not we feel that other people are going to be consistently available to us and receptive to us when we're in need of their support. And we think this is really useful for you to start to reflect on and consider in relation to your mental health, because we know that one of the factors that has a very significant impact on our mental well-being is the quality of our relationships. And so we think learning about our individual attachment patterns can be useful to us in being able to perhaps predict how certain types of relationships, how certain types of interaction are going to affect us. So our first attachment relationships are with our parents, our caregivers, other significant family members, the people that will have been around us in our early formative years. And these attachment relationships will later influence the patterns and quality of our relationships and interactions with others as we move through life, for good and for bad. Although it's important to emphasize here that whilst these patterns can get quite well established, particularly in certain contexts for us, it's important to emphasize that they're not completely fixed. So we can, with some conscious work on it, influence the attachment patterns that we have in our adult relationships. So attachment is a phenomenon we find in all mammals, and the purpose of it, again, we're thinking about our survival as a species, has been to protect our immature young against dangers and promote affectionate bonds between relatives. So in this sense, like we were saying with the basic emotions, it is a kind of inbuilt, instinctive reaction pattern within us. So when a child experiences something uncomfortable, which could be, for example, an experience of hunger, thirst, frustration, or fear, we have this inbuilt instinct to turn towards our attachment figures with an expectation that they are going to be able to respond to us in a way that soothes the discomfort and makes us comfortable again. And in the same way that we have, our young have that inbuilt instinct to call out in distress in the expectation of being responded to, the attachment figure has an equally instinctive reaction to the signals of unease on the part of the child. For example, when one hears a child whimpering or crying, one feels an instinctive response to try to respond, to soothe that. And that's a signal that the caregiver needs to attend to the child in some way. And I suppose this sort of template for an emotional interaction becomes the template for how we become emotionally regulated. So to be responded to be given food or something to drink, or to be reassured when we're fearful, or to be smiled at, leads to an establishment of an inner image of an attachment person that's associated in our minds with an experience of well-being or some experience of reward. Some discomfort is taken away and we're made comfortable again. So as that experience happens over and over through our early formative years, we can, as it were, internalize an image of this attachment figure that's whereby just the thought of them at times can be enough to calm oneself. So this is the standard path towards emotional self-regulation, how we learn to be able to soothe ourselves when we're in distress. However, before we've achieved that ability to regulate our own emotions within the the context of a reasonable amount of emotional activation, before we've achieved that developmental milestone, as it were, the experience of being separated from our attachment figures usually involves then feelings of unease and fear. And if you recall, when we go back to those basic emotions that we covered in the last module, one of those was something called separation anxiety and sadness. And that's what we're referring to here, that's an inbuilt emotional reaction pattern to the experience of unease that we feel when we're separated from our caregivers or significant others. So just to develop further this idea of a template through which we get our emotional needs met, and through which we take forward in our life as a way of getting support when we need it, we can start to think of the idea of these key attachment figures being what we might refer to as a secure base. So we, in moments of unease and separation from our attachment figures, we have this inbuilt instinct, as it were, to seek out our secure base again and return to it, and hopefully gain some reassurance from our attachment figures, our secure base, which then gives us the confidence to then perhaps go out and explore the world a bit more. So you might have observed something of this happening on the tube trains, for instance, or on a bus, where you may have observed a parent and a young infant or toddler. They come onto the train, and to begin with, the toddler keeps close to their parent or attachment figure. But as they start to gain a bit more confidence in the situation, essentially it's a strange situation, there are strangers on the carriage. When they start to gain confidence, they might feel a bit bolder in themselves can start to move up and down the carriage. They might look at different people. They might be exploring various things, the seats in the carriage, things like that. And then the train might pull in at another station and some people get off and new strangers come on. And you might notice that the infant, in that moment, the situation has changed again. It's become uncertain. There are new people. And you might observe the infant seeks out their parent again, returns to the parent, because they may feel a degree of unease, that sense of anxiety from their secure base. They feel they need to go back to that again. And then as things settle again, the process starts again. So there's very much this notion of a secure base that we want to return to when we feel unease or discomfort or distress. That's this inbuilt sort of relational pattern that we have in ourselves. The problem for us is a bit like we were saying with the basic emotions. Depending on our experiences, we can suppress or modify those inbuilt patterns. Because some of you might be thinking, well, I don't feel that I have a secure base, or I don't feel confident that people are going to be there for me, so I don't tend to reach out when I'm in distress. So these different patterns are what we're going to go on to now in the module to explore in a bit more detail and make sense of these different patterns. In humans, it's been possible to observe different attachment patterns or strategies, they may be referred to. There's been a lot of research on this, and one can broadly notice these three different attachment patterns or strategies, which we are going to go on to explain each of them in more detail. It's important to emphasize here that we're simplifying something that in reality is much more complicated. So we're defining these three different patterns, but in reality it's possible to show mixtures of these different patterns in different relationships in our lives or at different times in our lives, depending on what we're going through at any point interpersonally. So, but essentially, these patterns are observed when we have an experience of separation from our attachment figures. And you can observe these patterns in infants as well, which we're going to go on to explain. But the patterns really describe our reaction when we are triggered to seek out our attachment figure, either by a period of separation from them or an experience of discomfort, distress, unease. So you observe how we deal with that separation from our attachment figure, but it's equally important that we observe how we respond when we are reconciled with our attachment figure again, when we get back together again, how we are able to recover our sense of secure relationship. So essentially these patterns of different styles are a reflection of how secure or not we feel that people are going to be consistently there for us in a supportive way or not. It's important to emphasize with you here also that whilst these patterns do have an impact on the quality of our relationships and our mental health and our well-being, it's quite common across society to have insecure attachment patterns or elements of that in our experiences. So as I was saying, you can see the different attachment styles and patterns and strategies operating in infants from about the age of 18 months. And you can test the predominant attachment strategy that's showing by observing how the child reacts when they are separated from their attachment person, which quite often would be the mother, but it could be father, grandparent, aunt, uncle. And in this test situation, the mother leaves the room after a while and leaves the child alone in the presence of an unfamiliar person, an observer in the test situation, who is a stranger, and in that sense their presence will activate the child's wish to seek their secure base. So in this test scenario, the situation of being both abandoned by one's attachment figure and in the same room with a complete stranger triggers the basic emotion of separation anxiety and fear in most children. And so one observes how the child deals with that situation, how they react to the separation, but equally importantly, how they react when the mother returns to the room again after a short period of time. So in that test situation, a child who's displaying what we would a so-called secure attachment, they react with unease and protest to the signal that the mother is going to leave the room. So in a secure attachment strategy, it's normal to experience unease and distress at separation from one's attachment figure. But the securely attached child settles relatively quickly after the attachment figure or mother has left the room. And after a while, they might start to play with some toys in the room. They settle down. And when the mother returns, the child quite readily goes to the mother. They may whine a bit because they've experienced, it's been distressing for them to have that separation, but they relatively quickly calm down. They might sit on the attachment figure's lap and they reconnect relatively easily. And after a short period of time, they may then resume playing. So this shows really a sense of security that one's attachment figure is going to return after the separation, and that they're a sense of confidence that they're going to be emotionally available to us and receptive to us. So, if we develop this attachment style or strategy relatively consistently as adults, This does help us to have more trusting relationships, lasting relationships. We're able to tolerate separations in our relationships better. We might tend to have slightly more secure sense of self-esteem. We might feel comfortable with sharing our feelings, our inner experiences with friends and partners. And we would naturally seek out social support in times of need. So that's the secure attachment pattern. Some children have what's called an insecure attachment pattern. And there are two types of these broadly that have been identified. There's the ambivalent or over-involved type, which we're going to explain here, and a more distanced type. So in this ambivalent or over-involved pattern, the child becomes insecure about their attachment person, in likelihood with good reason, probably because the attachment figure has been unpredictable in their availability to the child when they're distressed. That might be unpredictable in their physical presence, but also unpredictable in their emotional presence. So in order to attract their attachment person's attention, the child, we think, in this attachment strategy has learned to exaggerate their emotional expressions. So, for example, they express an excessive amount of unease and crying when their need for their attachment figure gets activated. So when we think about the test situation that we were describing previously, when such a child is abandoned in the test situation, the mother or caregiver leaves the room, they tend to cry loudly and cling to the attachment figure when they're about to leave the room. They don't want to let them leave. And then after the attachment figure, mother, caregiver has left the room, the child displaying this attachment strategy will have some difficulty in settling down, in quietening down and playing while the mother is away. Equally, when we observe how they respond when the mother returns, and this is where the what's called ambivalent part of the strategy shows, they are mixed about how they reconnect with the mother. So they might continue to cry and protest when the mother wants to pick them up and may even avoid being picked up. But they will gradually settle down. So they're a bit wary about, well, is my attachment figure really here for me? So that's where the ambivalent bit comes in, that they feel a sort of conflict inside, as it were, as actually I really want to reconnect with my mother, my attachment figure, but I'm not sure if she's permanently there for me. So I might have a sort of push and a pull within me towards reconnecting with them. And this push and pull with someone who's developed this attachment strategy does seem to sort of carry through into their adult relationships and might result in someone being very wary about entering new relationships or getting close to others. And then when we do, we might worry about, is our partner really there for us? Do they really love us? And we might also, where there's a threat of a separation or a relationship ending, we might become very distraught. And as I've said, that we think this strategy comes from having learnt that we can't fully trust that people will reliably be there for us in terms of their physical presence, but also in terms of how receptive they might be to us and our distress and our need for their support and help. So this leads to us perhaps trying to hold on tightly to people for fear that they will either leave us or stop caring for us. So the other kind of insecure attachment pattern or strategy is what's known as the distanced attachment pattern, or otherwise also known as detached or avoidant. It's in many ways the opposite of the ambivalent type that we've just described. So where the ambivalently attached child will have learned to exaggerate their emotional reactions, the distanced child exhibits little response, or they may not, it may not be visible that they are having a reaction to something. They are what's known as detached. So if we think about this in the test situation, the distanced child doesn't appear to react at all on their attachment figure leaving the room in the test situation. It's as if they, on the surface, don't care whether the mother leaves or returns. So they may not respond to mother leaving the room. They may be already playing with toys in the room and will just continue with that, seemingly not noticing that the mother has left the room. However, when children with this attachment strategy or pattern are measured for their physical responses to the separation, they show a great deal of stress in response to the situation. But in terms of their behaviour, they don't express this. So you can measure a stress hormone. This is something called cortisol. You can measure this in saliva. And so when children with this distanced attachment pattern are observed in the test situation and they test the levels of cortisol in their saliva, it shows a big increase during the separation from the attachment figure. So in a sense, it comes back to that point we were making when we were thinking about emotions, whereby the reaction pattern, the physiological reaction pattern of the emotion can be triggered in us, but that we don't become aware of the emotion, so we don't consciously register it as a feeling. And we think this is what's happening in individuals who've developed this more distanced strategy. They've learned, in a sense, to over-regulate their feelings. And we think this may have been a response to having experienced perhaps more prolonged periods of neglect, or having an experience of their feelings commonly being overlooked or being misunderstood and thought to be something else other than what they are feeling in the moment. Or in the worst scenarios, they may have even been given a very negative message about their distress, either ridiculed or been given an experience of someone being angry with them for being distressed or for what they were feeling. So they may have experienced some negative consequence to expressing their feelings. So to summarise, our attachment patterns or style is very much dependent on how our interactions with our early attachment figures develop. So the attachment patterns we display in adulthood are formed largely by our early childhood experiences in our attachment relationships. And our attachment pattern has much to do with how we attract attention or how ready we are to call out, to reach out for help when we're in distress. So, but what I would like to emphasize is that we shouldn't confuse this with the idea of attention-seeking behavior, which I don't think is a useful way of thinking about things, really. This is about how we adapt to survive if we're not able to attract attention to have our needs met in an ordinary way through signaling our distress. We might have had to find other ways of doing so, or other survival mechanisms for getting through life. It's also important to emphasize, I think, that we're simplifying things here and breaking things down into the key sort of attachment patterns. In reality, our profile, as it were, for each of us is going to be much more mixed. So it is possible to have a mixture of different insecure attachment strategies, or a mixture of sometimes insecure and sometimes secure. I think for me personally, I have had an experience of two key attachment experiences in my childhood. One of those was secure. The other, I think, generated in me a more distanced kind of strategy. And each of those gets activated at different times in different relationships. So the times in our adulthood experiences where these attachment patterns might get activated is particularly when we face separation or abandonment, or we're frightened or unsettled in some way. And the other thing to say is that the way we regulate our attachment relationships does have an influence on our lives, and that's why we think it's important to bring this to your attention so that you can start to consider the influence this has on key relationships in your life. So to help us develop our understanding of attachment patterns and strategies, we're just going to look again at Michelle and Lila's relationship. In this scenario, Lila has had to go away for a week on a course that she's wanted to do that's about developing her career. During the week that she's away, Michelle sends her a number of text messages, and she doesn't reply to these until she's on the train on her way home at the end of the week, because she'd been so engrossed in the workshops on the course. Michelle's messages ranged from initially telling her to wrap up warm because of the cold weather forecast there had been for the week, to asking her what she'd like for dinner the evening she returns from the trip, and then making suggestions about what they might do together over the weekend when she does return. On the final day, Michelle got really worried about the snow forecast and started checking obsessively the live train timetable for Lila's journey home. Upon her eventual return, Lila asked Michelle about his week, and he answered, I had a fantastic and busy week, and I had loads to do, and I wish I'd had more time. So I'd just like to invite you to think about this scenario in light of the different attachment strategies we've just thought about together for both Michelle and Lila. So what in the information we have here might tell us about what their underlying attachment strategies might be? And finally, why do we think Michelle answers in the way he does when Lila asks him how his week's been? So these are the themes that have tended to come out when we've discussed this in groups previously. Michelle seems to be displaying a predominantly insecure, ambivalent or preoccupied attachment pattern where he seems to be really struggling with the separation, and he's finding himself thinking about Lila all the time. He seems to be preoccupied with whether she's going to be able to return safely. He's thinking in his mind about, them getting back together again. People often say that they think he's coming across as very clingy, and indeed that is one of the, I suppose, the markers of a more ambivalent, preoccupied attachment pattern, whereby we get very preoccupied with the security of the relationship. There's often a question here about whether Lila is showing an insecure and distanced attachment pattern, whereby she seems to be not even having any reaction to the separation, or whether she's just secure and is not too fazed by the separation. One thing that might help us work that out, the difference, is that she doesn't seem to be experiencing any separation anxiety here, which would be normal in a more secure attachment pattern, that you would feel a degree of pain or pang or missing someone when separated from them, an important figure. She doesn't seem to be showing that, although again we've not given a lot of information here. And then when we think about Michelle's response when she has returned, saying that he's had this fantastic busy week, this perhaps is another manifestation of his insecure, ambivalent attachment pattern, whereby he's perhaps feels a little bit wary and mixed about reconnecting with her. So he's kind of having to say, look, actually, I've been fine here, and I'm not sure I needed you all this time that you were away. We've covered in this module how attachment relates really to how secure or not we feel that significant others in our lives are going to be consistently there for us, either physically or emotionally, and in a receptive way to want to be with us in our distress. And depending on how secure or not we feel in relation to that, we will have been influenced as to then how we deal with our own emotional needs, how much we call out for, reach out for help and support or not. So that we will have developed different survival strategies based on our early experiences. So I'd like to re-emphasize again, though, that whilst these patterns do have a significant impact on our adult relationships, they aren't fixed, and things are much more mixed in reality. It is possible to develop more secure relationships in adulthood, which is very much the work of psychotherapy in helping us to consider the quality of our relationships and how we can adapt the way we are in them to make them more fulfilling, more meaningful, more secure for us. So in this last task, given all that we've covered today in terms of these attachment patterns and strategies, I'd just like to invite you to think about the common attachment patterns or strategies you notice in yourself, in your current relationships in life. How does it show in those relationships? And then that will lead us into the final module, module 4, where we start to think a bit more specifically about the types of roles we might typically get into across our lives.